For the last few weeks, I've been talking about sponsoring the podcast because as the show's grown, we've gotten contacted by a lot of corporations with big ad budgets, but I don't feel good about that. It doesn't feel like it measures up to the kind of integrity that I want to have. But I know that there's a lot of people listening to this who are out there creating independent businesses and projects, and you're trying to find ways to promote that doesn't feel like you're selling your soul. And the reality is if you're listening to this, then chances are the people who would be interested in what you do are also listening to this. And sponsoring the podcast is an excellent way to connect to those people. And I'm super excited about those of you who have already reached out. You're going to get to learn about some of our new sponsors very soon. But listen, there's only so many slots available, and they are starting to fill up. And frankly, people who are taking spots are renewing because they're seeing a positive impact. So if it's something that you've been considering, now's a good time to jump in. Go to jbrownyoga.com/sponsor. Okay, you are listening to Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. We're back. That is, of course, if you're returning. If you're new, hello and welcome. I am returned home, but coming to you under unusual circumstances. I have come up against the wire before getting this out to you. And I might have even said this before in the past, but I really do think that this is the closest I've ever come to missing the deadline to get this out to you. It is 6:30 a.m. the day before this is supposed to post. And I'm not even usually up at this time. But my wife got called out on a thing, and I've been on solo dad duty all weekend long. And I was supposed to make this happen last night, but I laid down with my little one to help her fall asleep, and I fell asleep as well. I woke up a couple hours later like a complete zombie. So I just went to bed super early, and then I got up this morning to try to make this happen. And I'd never do this early in the morning like this, but the show must go on. It's actually kind of convenient in a way because today's episode with Seth Powell is lengthy. So I had already intended to keep this a short intro, and the universe has basically forced that upon me. So I do want to say something very briefly about today's talk. But before I do, I want to say something to anybody listening to this who's managing a studio or running their own show, and maybe you're using MindBody online and you're not happy about it. I know a lot of people aren't so happy about it. I talked to somebody recently. They raised his prices quite drastically. When I learned how much he was spending a year on his studio management software, I was kind of shocked. So there is an alternative, and today's sponsor, KarmaSoft, is that alternative. They've been sponsoring the podcast for a while now, and you've probably heard me say something about it before. But I am happy to say something about it again because this is the software that I used when I owned my studio in Brooklyn. And the owner, Rudy Senecal, he's been on the podcast. Go back and listen to the episode. You can hear all about the company and the way he runs it and the experience I had and why I'm such a fan of it. If you or anyone you know is a yoga, Pilates, or fitness center owner, manager, or teacher, you can make the work of scheduling your classes and doing the accounting and doing the payroll all much easier and more efficient by using KarmaSoft. Go to karmasoftonline.com. So today's episode with Seth Powell. Seth is a longtime listener of the podcast, I learned. And after listening to me talk about the history and philosophies of yoga with someone on the podcast, he emailed me and extended an invitation to take his online course on the subject, which I did, and I just have to say was fantastic. Very often when I've tried to put on a scholar hat and study yoga philosophy from a more academic perspective, I kind of become disinterested. Sometimes the language of academia it's very dry, and it never really ignited much in me. So most of the study that I've done has kind of been on my own. But Seth, he was a guy who I felt like I could really relate to. And I think you'll hear that today. So I spent the first half hour just trying to learn why it is I felt like I could relate to him. And then we spent another hour and a half talking about the history and philosophies of yoga. So it's a very informative, interesting, and I think brings up many important threads. I'm very excited for you to get to hear it today. Quickly before we do, let me just drop some of my stuff. I am going to be in Hamilton, New Jersey, February 9th. I'm going to be in Portland, Maine, February 23rd, 24th. And I'm going to be back in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, March 16th. I'm going to do a workshop in the afternoon, and then there will be a live podcast event, March 16th in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And you can come. It's going to be fun. You can find out about all of those gigs and more, and find the archives of this podcast and read my blog and check out all of my online yoga video stuff at jbrownyoga.com. All right, you guys, I'm going to have this just be it, because there's a good chance that my youngest daughter could call out any moment. So we'll have much more of a check-in next week. And I will touch base with you on the other side to just let you know who's coming on. But that's going to be it. Let's just go ahead now and get to this talk that I had with Seth Powell. Well, listen, Seth, it's super fun to get a chance to talk to you, man.
Yeah, likewise, Jay. As you know, as I told you, I've been a big fan of the podcast for a long time now. I think a couple of years. So cool to kind of have this more formal opportunity to chat, get to know each other a little bit better.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, it was such a lovely gesture that you made when you sent me that email and invited me to take your course, which I enjoyed and learned a lot from, as I think I told you in an email. And, just for you, like, one of the great things for me is I'm very familiar with, like, some of the work that's being done with the Hatha Yoga Project. And, I'm not really sort of academically minded by nature, but I certainly, read Mark Singleton's book, Yoga Body, and was like, wow, like, it was like a game changer, I think, for a lot of people, in terms of, like, a perspective on the history of yoga. And sort of like all these sort of myth and origin stories that we're told that maybe weren't as true as we might have thought they were. And so in any case, I'm aware of that, but I'm a little bit intimidated by it, honestly. Like, I had Harish Wallace on because I wanted to talk about Abhinav Gupta, and he was sort of like the one guy who was talking about that guy. So I felt like I had an in. But, like, for some reason, like, I'm sure if I reached out to, like, Singleton or Mountain, they probably would come on, and I would love to talk to them, but I haven't, because I have, like, a little, I don't know, a thing in me about it. And then you sent me your thing, and you're in that same realm. But when I saw that first video of you in the course, I was like, oh, that guy, like a guy I went to college with, that guy. Like, I felt like you and I have more of, like, a similar background, maybe. Like, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. My brother went to UC Santa Barbara. I got into UCLA and NYU, but I chose to go to NYU. And I feel like, from what I know of you, I did, like, a little research on you also. And it seems like you and I both share a bit of a similar beginning. Like, it was both a college years where yoga really kind of became a thing for us, which makes sense because it's kind of like that formative time where you're trying to figure out who you are and, like, how you want to be in the world. And so I guess for me, all of that is just to say that I felt like you gave me a very nice in to this world of academic scholarship around the history of yoga that I think is kind of what you're about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could see from the outside it could be maybe a bit intimidating. If you try to read some of his academic prose or scholarship, it's filled with lots of academic jargon, and it can seem very elitist, even maybe a bit daunting from the outside. And I think, as you know, even just in the work that I'm doing with yogic studies, I'm trying to bridge that gap a little bit more between some of this really cutting edge and exciting new scholarship on yoga history, yoga philosophy, that's taking place really around the world, but a lot of it is centered, I would say, in Europe and in the UK right now at SOAS with the Hatha Yoga project. But try to bridge this gap between this scholarship and the academic study of yoga with the broader public yoga world, yoga community of yoga teachers and practitioners who I think are genuinely interested in the history of their own traditions and want to yoga beyond asana in more depth, but don't always know where to go, where to turn, or what to sink their teeth into reliably. So I kind of see myself as trying to serve a bit of a bridge there. And I guess you're right that we probably do have more of that similar background. I mean, I have a pretty unconventional path to doing a PhD at Harvard University and to academia. An unconventional path that's probably not very unconventional for most yogis or yoga teachers today, probably a very similar background and path, kind of like you were alluding to. But in terms of, like in the academic circles and worlds that I inhabit, I guess a less traditional one.
I mean, did you have any inclination towards like academic study previously before you got into religious studies, or like were you like a really good student earlier in your life or anything like that?
No, couldn't have been further from the truth. I was terrible. In fact, I mean, I was basically like a high school dropout. I mean, I barely graduated from high school just by the hairs on my back. My high school senior English teacher sort of saw something in me, took some pity, and I should have failed that class, but she gave me like a D or something that was passing and that enabled me to graduate from high school. And then I did like the community college route, actually down in Southern California. So my first college years were in San Diego, and I bounced around to a few different community colleges down there. And yeah, just kind of found my way in the world as a young adult, living on my own for the first time. And yeah, as you said, like those very formative years, 18, 19, which was right when I discovered yoga. My first yoga class was actually at a 24-hour fitness gym in San Diego. And it was definitely in the kind of fitness model of yoga. It was like looking...
What year was that? Do you remember?
That would have been like 2006 or 7.
So it had already got to the gyms by then for sure. Like, and it must have been a kind of Ashtanga inspired vinyasa kind of thing, I would imagine.
It was like a vinyasa flow based class. I mean, looking back on it, of course, I had no idea at the time, but there was definitely a vinyasa element to it. It certainly was not Ashtanga vinyasa. I don't think I would have survived an hour of that at that time.
Yes.
And they're not offering that at the gym. You know, they're going to offer something that's a little bit more accessible to the less flexible or bendy, which was me at the time. I mean, I certainly couldn't touch my toes. I was always, I guess, a little bit athletic. I grew up playing sports, playing basketball in particular, but had no awareness or connection to my body or how to really move it intentionally. And I think, like many people, you know, that first class was something new happened there. There was a new awareness that I gained about my body when you start breathing intentionally and drawing awareness to the breath and just moving in a more conscious way, even though I could only do about half of the postures. And I was incredibly intimidated looking around the room at all these super strong and bendy bodies who'd clearly been doing the practice for a while. And people, you know, the teacher always saying, and if you'd like, you can now take the full wheel, here, or if it's not comfortable, you can just lie there on your back,
Well, it seems like I always have this feeling like there's certain people who have some unexplainable pull that makes that after that first class, it just sort of like decide, oh yeah, this is going to be like my thing, or it becomes very important kind of right away. The same thing happened to me. I started going quite religiously right away, and I can't fully explain it. It wasn't just because it was the physical part. There was something, I don't know, there was some other reason why I have an inclination or an interest or desire to pursue it. Would you say that that's true for you? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Given our backgrounds, why would we be spending so much time thinking about yoga?
Well, a couple things for me, at least in my story in connection with yoga. I mean, the first thing is when I left that class, we did like a pretty lengthy shavasana, which was probably the first time I had just laid down like that and rested in that manner, certainly after any sort of physical exercise. And I just remember when I left the gym and walked back to my car, I just felt like I was floating and had, it's that sort of combination of relaxation yet being sort of flooded with energy. And I felt like alive in a way that I hadn't in years, maybe, I don't want to say ever, but in a new way. And I was at this time kind of coming out of like a deep depression that had been basically like heavily medicated by marijuana and had been like kind of very stuck and at a place in my life where I had very little direction and was starting to kind of open up and try to seek alternative ways of living and thinking and being. And so yoga was kind of a part of that. It kind of fit into that period of exploration to try to get out of this kind of tamas of darkness and depression that I was in at that time.
Yeah, it opened up all kinds of possibilities, right?
It did, and it just felt good in a way that I hadn't. And so I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to come back. And yeah, so I started coming back to that class every week and then taking other classes. And then I found kind of like more local, actual proper studio. And yeah, I think once I kind of got an experience of it, I did realize quite early there was definitely something. There was a lot going on there in that one little room at 24-Hour Fitness, and a lot more that I wanted to explore. And so I kind of jumped in, and then also immediately started reading about it, whatever I could kind of get my hands on at that time, online, and then kind of starting to pick up some of the yogic literature, like pretty much right away.
And I heard you say that you were kind of started teaching even before you did that training was a little bit of an afterthought. Is that right? Did I hear that right?
That's true. So after I finished community college in San Diego, I kind of did the California community college CSU track. So after you finish your gen ed in community college, you can then transfer pretty easily to any school in the state. So I could pretty much go to any university I wanted to. But I guess the kind of hippie in me at the time had it narrowed down to Santa Cruz or Humboldt University up in the Redwoods.
Yeah.
And I went and visited that campus and was just blown away at Humboldt State University. I don't know if you're familiar with that part of the world.
I am. My brother, like I said, my brother went to UC Santa Barbara, and I had lots of friends who went to UC Santa Cruz. I've certainly been up to Humboldt, but I would have picked Humboldt too. Santa Cruz is just like the party school.
It's like the party school. This is something else. This is almost off the grid. It's up in the deep north, like right at the border of Oregon, but right on the coast of California. So you have this rare combination of the beautiful Pacific, rugged Northern California coastline, but then just a couple miles inland, you have hundreds and hundreds of acres of pristine redwood forests. And then this little college town right in the middle with 15,000 people, 8,000 college students. And yeah, I just totally fell in love with it. So I knew that that's where I was going to go. I didn't even apply anywhere else at that time.
And when you were going there, you didn't have it in mind to study religious studies You didn't go there with that in mind, did you?
I didn't even know that was a thing. I think like most people. I actually went there at that time. I had been doing actually some like environmental activism work and was like pretty into kind of like climate justice and sustainability work and kind of a little bit on the front lines of that world. But I was continuing a yoga practice. I had begun reading a lot of this literature. I was heavily influenced by like Jack Kornfield's like A Path with Heart, Ram Dass's Be Here Now, some of those kind of classic Western spiritual texts, you might say. And so India was definitely on my radar. And I in those early years too, in a very naive and like romanticized way of this idea of I had these visions of running off and becoming a sort of wandering sadhu or something in India that were already kind of growing at that time. Mm. But because of my interest in environmentalism, I actually I had, I guess, an unusual journey to get to Humboldt State University. I actually decided to walk from San Diego up to Humboldt.
What?
Which is like about 1,000 miles.
What? Come on. I mean, I relate because
coast of California.
Well, listen, I relate to it on a lot of levels because there was certainly a time in my life where I was trying to be as much of a monk as I could in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So I relate to that. You might have done that, but that's a long walk. So you actually, did you just like bring a tent and sleep on the road, or what? How did that happen?
Yep. I was a total Dharma bum. You know, in fact, the one book I had with me was Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums. And I had my rucksack. I was part of the rucksack revolution there. You know, I had my backpack. I don't think I could do this today, actually. This is just over 10 years ago, but I don't think I could do this today even in the same way. I hitchhiked a little bit, but by and large, I walked, you know, about 20 to 30 miles every day. I had my backpack with a tent and sleeping bag and my boots and everything I needed just on my back. It took me the entire summer, about 2.5 months, walking kind of one step at a time.
Wait a second. So nobody convinced you to rent a car? Come on, really? That's crazy, man. You walked all that way.
I had this like really strong sankalpa or intention. In fact, I did like a bunch of fundraising for it. I like made it this whole thing. It was like my pilgrimage for peace. I was very inspired actually by this book and this life story of this man named John Francis, who also goes by the Planet Walker. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He lives up in Northern California near Point Reyes.
I think I might have seen a video of him at one point in time.
He's an incredible man. African-American man, which is unusual in this community in Point Reyes. He's probably one of the only ones. I mean, his story very briefly is like in the 70s, he was living near San Francisco and he witnessed like one of those big oil tankers crash off the coast of the bay, and he saw all the damage of all this oil spill, and all of the kind of disaster on the bay that took place there. And he decided he no longer wanted to be a part of that problem, contributing to the damage that fossil fuels were having on our planet. And so he decided to start walking everywhere and to stop using cars and automobiles at the time. This was like in the late 70s. And then he found himself, he kept getting in all these arguments with people on the side of the road. People would offer him rides and he'd say, no, why don't you take my ride? Oh, I'm doing it because such and such and such. People felt like he was then attacking them. He's like, no, I'm not attacking you. I'm just telling you why I'm not riding with you. So he decided to take a vow of silence on, I think like his 30th birthday for one day. And that one day of silence turned into like, I think 20 years of silence. He never spoke, and he walked. He ended up walking the entire country. He spent like the next 20 plus years just walking in silence and doing this kind of environmental activism just through the nature of his vrata, his vow of silence and walking.
But how did he get like food and stuff? How did he sustain?
How did the monks and sadhus and bhikshus of India, how did they survive? They
But
put out
I
their
always
bowl.
thought that was a very cultural thing. Like there was alms bowls, and it was considered like part of the culture to provide. But I don't know that that's true in our country.
That's true. And if you read his story, I mean, he had many, dangerous encounters. You can imagine, a black man walking through the country on foot. He's not always going
Not
to
talking.
he's not talking very well, and he has some very dangerous run-ins in certain parts of the country. But, he would have a pad and paper, and he'd write a note, or he'd have a sign, he'd explain what he's doing. And I think more people than not would be super fascinated and inspired by his vision, his message, and want to offer him something. And that was certainly the case. That was certainly the case for me.
Well, you know what it makes me think is a little bit like even just recently been having all these very controversial episodes. You listen, so you've been listening. And it's sort of been like, well, if you want to be a real ally, then you would need to account for things that you've done in the past and change your behavior going forward. So on some very fundamental level, if we believe that fossil fuels is not our future and it's killing the planet and we should be transitioning off of them, if we really believe that, then to fully embody that belief would mean to do something like what he is doing, Like we're all hedging or something a little bit.
Absolutely. We all know, and we share these links on Facebook and social media. We know either time's up or we have a little short window to do something. And yet, a lot of us have to still make food. We still have to take care of the kids. We still have to work. We have to go on with our day. And I think a lot of us are doing the best that we can, but it's probably not enough. And if you really read any of the scientific literature on climate change, I didn't realize we were going to get into all of this, but I mean, there's no disagreement, about the major causes of that, which, I mean, to be frank, not only fossil fuels, but also the meat industry and the way meat is mass produced in this country, which is very heavily related.
Well, it's very interesting to me, Seth, is like we had this little mix up with the tech at the beginning. And I had originally thought that I wanted to ask you about the fires, because I know a lot of people who were there and there's been all these fires. So in a way, we've got to where I was going to start originally with the climate change. And just to ask, I know you were affected by the fires. I saw some post of you like fleeing them, just to ask, is everybody okay in your world? Did you lose property? Like there's a lot going on in that part of the world that has to do with climate change right now.
Yeah, we're okay. We're all okay. My family's okay, and all our structures are intact. But this is year 2 in a row where there's been basically the biggest fires in this area on record. The one last year, there's a few in Northern and Southern California, but the big major one here that tore through Santa Rosa started just a mile from where I'm sitting right now at the outskirts of this town where we're living here of Calistoga. It was called the Tubbs Fire. And yeah, it was one of the most devastating fires on record here. I was actually still at Harvard in Cambridge. The fire hit the night before I was about to start my comprehensive exams at Harvard. So, and I was there in this intensive tapasya study mode. But my wife, Charlotte, and our 2 children were already here. They had come early because Charlotte's parents live here. And she was actually with the kids staying the night at her best friend's home in Santa Rosa the night the fire hit. They were awoken at 2 a.m. by the sheriff who was coming through town, waking everybody up. And they awoke to seeing the flames outside the window, didn't even have time to grab their shoes or wallet, just grabbed the kids and the dog and jumped, all packed, like 10 of them packed into the SUV, and they fled in the middle of the night and basically got out of there like just in the nick of time, because Charlotte's friend's neighborhood, the entire neighborhood, by the next morning was completely decimated. I mean, when we returned, actually returned about a month later. I mean, it looked as if a bomb had gone off there or something. It was totally eerie and unfathomable, the destruction that this fire had, because it was in these very residential areas. I think that's what was so striking about it. It's not just the forested or hilled areas, but it really struck through major urban and residential areas. So, I mean, thousands of people, many friends and people we know who just totally lost everything and then have had to start over. And so that was last year. And now just, like about a month ago, we had this other one that was a little bit further from us. So there wasn't an evacuation warning here in our town, but the air quality, I think, as you saw, was so horrendous, really in this entire San Francisco Bay Area and Northern Bay Area, all the way inland and up and down the coast. I mean, we saw these reports that the air quality and the toxicity in San Francisco was the worst of any city in the world, worse than New Delhi or Beijing.
Well, I was visiting my sister in Vancouver this last spring, and we were just driving along the coast. We made a road trip of it, and we came across fires just along the side of the road while we were driving along. We're like, holy crap. And it was really freaky to kind of drive into the earth being on fire. It's freaking biblical. It's, you know what I mean? It's like,
it's kind of crazy. And
that's getting back to this guy that you were inspired by. That's what he was seeing. That's what he was seeing. And he was embodying that in a very real way. And you were inspired by that enough to walk to school. Wow.
Absolutely. I read his book, and then I got gifted his book after I graduated high school. Finally picked it up, read it. And then my stepmother actually had met him before. And so she actually arranged for me to get to meet him in person. We went and had lunch in Point Reyes. And this guy was like superhero to me, having read his book. And then I got to sit down face to face, and I saw he was just kind of like a normal dude. But
was he now talking, or is he still silent?
No, he broke his silence like a few decades ago. And now he gives TED Talks and stuff.
Okay.
And is... he now kind of ironically travels around a bit more. He does use fossil fuels in some ways now because he's created all these advocacy groups and programs and is doing all this amazing work. So I think he realized at a certain point in his journey that to have the biggest impact, you kind of had to pick your battles, I guess.
Interesting.
But he inspired me so much in history that I realized I wanted to do kind of my own little mini version of that. So when I got accepted to Humboldt, I decided I was going to walk on this pilgrimage. And I raised some money, a little bit of money to be able to do it. And then said goodbye to all my friends and community in San Diego. And then, set off and I walked to school.
Wow. And how long did it take you again?
It took me about 2.5 months. Basically the whole summer.
But you made it.
I made it. And I made it in the best shape of my life.
I bet. I bet.
And I'll say, long story short, there's so many things that happened on that journey. It's an incredible way to transition to a new place. Just literally one
you literally
step,
walk out into the big open world. You know what I mean? You it's like that movie Into the Wild or whatever, but you walked out into the coastline. What a great way to start it off. And you were supported. Nobody told you were crazy.
Oh no, people definitely told me I was crazy. All the way through, for sure. But my parents, bless them, they saw it and they saw what it was and they supported it. My father was so proud. He put together this crossing of the Golden Gate Bridge ceremony when I got up to San Francisco, and so he invited all these people and friends and family out to meet me at the Golden Gate Bridge for this crossing of the bridge kind of ceremony. And what was really cool actually about it is that we invited John Francis to come. We invited the Planet Walker himself, and he gave a little speech and then walked with us across the Golden Gate Bridge. So it was kind of like this momentous moment in that journey.
Wow, man, that's pretty awesome. That's a pretty crazy thing that you did there. And it goes to what I was originally kind of curious about, is that that's not the thing that everybody does, that there was something in you that took on that I don't know what you used the word with the tapas of that or whatever, or you wanted to make that commitment to something that you believed in, and then you wanted to embody it. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I have one of those personalities. It's like, okay, if I get into something, I'm going to dive really deep into it. If I get into yoga, it's like, okay, well, I guess I got to do a PhD at Harvard on it. You know,
right?
Well, I mean, I got to go all the way through with it.
Well, when did you know that you wanted to pursue yoga as a form of like a research or academic study?
Yeah, that didn't come until a bit later, really, because again, still at that point, I was very much more of kind of the hippie environmentalist amateur yogi, kind of California boy, I guess. And I think though, really that trip did many things for me and kind of coming into the person who I would become. But it also really cemented my own yoga practice or sadhana, because I had been doing in San Diego after the 24-Hour Fitness. I had kind of been doing yoga at various studios in San Diego for a little while with different teachers, different postural, yoga systems. But it was really that 2.5 months where I really broke out into my own personal practice, like a very serious daily practice. So I would begin every day with meditation and like a pretty formal kind of asana practice. I would do like a 10-minute headstand on the beach looking out at the ocean kind of thing,
Yeah. No, I went through a whole period of time where it was like every morning I had very regimented a seated meditation. I did there was like a period where I wouldn't, a day didn't go by that I didn't do that at the start of it. There was a period of time where that was like really necessary for me.
I had like a very regular routine kind of on the road there that involved yoga and meditation and journaling and walking meditation. The whole thing was meditation, really.
Yeah.
So that really cemented my own yoga practice. And so by the time I got to Humboldt, I kind of I thought I was going to do this interdisciplinary major where I was going to kind of combine environmental studies. I was actually at the time very interested in Native American and indigenous traditions, but then also very drawn to kind of Asian and Eastern spiritual traditions. So I was going to try to do some sort of create your own interdisciplinary major at Humboldt, and I had to get the sign-offs from the chair of each of those departments in order to do that. And I got it from environmental studies. I got it from Native American studies. And so I had to go knock on the door of religious studies. And I get there, and it's this professor, Stephen Jenkins. And I tell him who I am and how I got here and what I want to do. And he was like, "Oh, well, you sound like a religious studies major." He's like, "Everything that you're describing and what you want to do, you can do that within our program and department." He's like, "So why don't you think about it? I'm not going to sign that right now." And I walked out like really pissed off. There was this one person who was standing in the way of like me creating this major that I had been thinking about for like 2.5 months and planning to do this.
And
thing.
you fucking walked there, man.
Yeah, I had it, and he wouldn't sign it. So he was like,
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.